Do that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Jeffrey Huber. He is a principal at Brooks Scarpa, and he manages the firm's South Florida office. And Brooks Scarpa is a multidisciplinary practice that includes architecture, landscape, planning, environmental design, materials research, graphic, furniture, and interior design services that produce innovative, sustainable, iconic buildings in urban environments. And in addition to his role there, he's an associate professor of the School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University in downtown Fort Lauderdale. And a quick note, I first heard about Brooks and Scarpa because they had some projects here in Miami Beach, and they were really interesting designs. You know, a lot of the new buildings we see are kind of white, and they just try to fade in and also overwhelm everything else. But the Brooks Scarpa designs really seem to fit in and I think give a sense of whimsy and excitement that we're missing from a lot of new design. So we're excited for tonight's talk, and please welcome Jeffrey.
Thank you. I called this talk tonight, Windy, Hot, Historic, Flooded, and Unaffordable. You may think it's a story about South Florida. It is, but it's a love story. I'm always an optimist. I just want to say thank you, Daniel, for the invite, and thank you to the Miami Design Preservation League for having me here today. And I was honored to give the honorarium back to you guys because you are a staple in the community, and I appreciate everything you guys do too. But a little bit about me, because I've known this building as a kid. Lived through a little wind event in 1992 called Hurricane Andrew. Many of you probably heard of that. My house is actually right up there on the corner. It was my childhood home. I was 12 years old when this hurricane hit. It's what really encouraged me and got me interested in architecture and even landscape architecture. So I'm a landscape architect and an architect. And you know, our practice, being from Miami, we are headquartered actually in Los Angeles, and we have an office here in Fort Lauderdale. And so my partners, Larry and Angie, Larry's kind of center there in the black shirt on the photograph on the right. Angie's there in the white, kind of kneeling down. So Angela Brooks, Larry Scarpa, our husband and wife team. I joined the firm in 2009 as a partner. They wanted me to move out to LA. I would not move out to LA because I loved Florida too much and wanted to kind of stay here. And so, you know, I actually was exiled in Arkansas for about 10 years and moved back in 2014 and you know, took the position at Florida Atlantic University and set up our office in Fort Lauderdale. I kind of talk about this in the images too because, you know, preservation is an important aspect to us. We always say the most sustainable building is the building that already exists. You know, and especially today, we're looking at a lot of adaptive reuse projects. We're looking at how can we take even sometimes the most banal buildings, the most nondescript. And so our office in Fort Lauderdale, which is the building on the left, was actually a terrazzo showroom from the 1950s that we converted. And it was incredible. It had Dade County pine in the ceiling. We actually had to lift part of the building up out of the floodplain and make it flood adaptive. But when we did that, we also had to raise the roof. And so we took the Dade County pine and actually made our little conference room table that you can see onto the bottom right-hand side of that image. And just trying to reuse what we find, and so it doesn't go into the landfill. It doesn't kind of go in there. And you can see these are, again, very nondescript buildings, but the same is true with our LA office. It was actually an old auto parts store that we converted into these buildings. And so we always kind of think of ourselves as urban pioneers coming into areas and finding what people don't see or don't value, and how do we kind of rethink them and finding these kind of gritty places. And you have a lot of places, even when I was a kid, going to high school at New World School of the Arts in downtown Miami, I would always go to the design district, and that was not a place. It was a pretty rough place. And even where I was in New World, when it was 5 o'clock, I mean, you could watch tumbleweeds going down the street in the 90s. You know, it was not what it is today. And these kind of vibrant places is what we really care about, what we try to inculcate and really try to breed. But we are an office of about 30 people between both coasts. So we have about 10 people here and 20 people out in LA. And so I just wanted to kind of share a few of our projects to kind of bridge into tonight's discussion, which will really kind of get into some of the interesting work we're doing here locally. So this is going to kind of touch on some of our California work at the beginning and some of our Florida work, but ultimately end on some of the Miami beach work. So one of the things, like I said, we find these old buildings. This was actually a Fuller Paints building in Los Angeles that was in jeopardy of being torn down. But ironically, the developer that owned the building at the time found out that this building was going to cost them way too much to demolish. And so we went ahead and got it for a bargain. We actually became one of the developers in this, bought this building, and looked at how could we create artist lofts. This was a community that was already starting to develop. It had a light rail transit system, so it was part of this transit-oriented development, walkable district that they were really trying to galvanize. And one of the ways we did that was we converted the lofts into artist apartments, but then also created luxury and market rate apartments on top of the building because the structure was, again, very robust. And so that was how we kind of made this building work. This was done right at 2009, so it was at the wrong time in the market, as you would say. But you can kind of see the quality of adaptive reuse that sometimes old buildings can be brought to new life, and so this is just one of those examples. A recent project that we worked on, we like to do a lot of community infrastructure, we call it. And so when we do community infrastructure, these are parks projects, these are public realm projects, these are projects that are really near and dear to us. So what my partner Larry always says is we don't have a specific typology we chase. We're known a lot for our affordable housing. That's probably about 50% of our work. But as he would say, we would do a doghouse as long as you'd let us design it well. And so we just care about design, care about kind of sustainability, and care about the communities in which we're working in. And so this project just happens to be in Pompano Beach, Florida. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Sample McDougall house, but that Sample McDougall house was a pioneering family in the early 1900s that came to, if you know Sample Road in Broward County, Sample Road was named because of the pioneer. It wasn't, that was their last name. It was a pineapple farm. And the McDougalls actually went ahead and bought the house from them, but they moved this house as a part of the historic preservation of the home. It was in jeopardy of being demolished. They moved it, and this is the number 2 is over that historic Sample McDougall house. And what they asked us to do was, this is a museum. The house is actually a museum built out of Dade County pine. It's actually a beautiful pioneer kind of example of this early vernacular, cracker vernacular type houses that are in this area. But the site is called Centennial Park. And so it was the 100-year anniversary that they developed this property. The house was moved there, and they asked us to really put in a permanent pavilion, open air pavilion for them, for open air, what the client called jelly jar weddings. They wanted to have a pavilion that could go ahead and generate income for the property to support the museum and do other things. And so they wanted the open air breeze, or the open air pavilion, to look a lot like the house. And we said that was a mistake. So the first things that we really thought about was, how do we make the building look laconic? That is, iconic, we all know, right? You big, bold. As an architect, you never want to do that. You want your building to stand out. But we thought this historic building was so incredible. We took a point to move it away from the home, tuck it into the trees, open up to the prevailing breezes to the southeast. North is actually the bottom of the page heading out, and over this kind of open retention pond they have. And then really made it look more like a barn building, or an open barn building to that property. And so this is what it looks like today. You see the house off to the side. Very simple structure. I mean, I'd actually lock myself to these columns if I was ever going to go through a hurricane because it's a pretty robust structure. But one of the key things that we thought about too was, when you're in a wedding, it frames the historic home. So the whole historic home becomes the backdrop of this pavilion. And it was really a challenge working with the community leaders, with the city of Pompano Beach, as well as with the Sample McDougall Preservation Society, because we were really always kind of talking about how this architecture was going to come to be to celebrate the architecture that was already there on this site. And it wasn't until we finished the building, closed it down, and now that they have events planned almost every weekend out for the next 2 years, that it changed the kind of mindset of this. And so this building is actually becoming heavily used and having these kind of events, these jelly jar weddings, as was kind of said, but really, again, kind of paying homage to the original structure by just literally setting back into the park. Now, we did something opposite across the street. There's a parking lot that's across Centennial Park. It's now called U Sports Complex. And so we were a little bit more bold using yellow, but we also knew that we were near that historic structure, so we're kind of cladding this in a concrete, but being playful. And this also becomes shade infrastructure for the community. This is going to be a kids soccer. And if anybody knows, little boys love to destroy things. So we had to make this the most robust building that we possibly could. And so it's really a concrete jacket with this kind of yellow box rib inside. But we're even from the street, this front facade operates like a billboard building in a way, and actually becomes part of the signage. And inside there, it's a vernacular, traditional kind of building. It's a wraparound porch around this kind of what is office spaces for the parks department and restrooms, as well as a concession facility. But you can see, we also put a robust amount of fans in there because, this was, again, if you all know, a lot of athletes, especially young athletes, are overheating now as we get hotter temperatures. And so the building was really meant to harvest the southeast prevailing breezes, but also becoming a piece of cooling infrastructure and heat infrastructure for the community. And this was done just before the pandemic was when we had the building designed, and it was under a GO bonds project. And if you guys know GO bond, general obligation bond funding, there's no extra dollars in anything. And so this building was about $700,000 budgeted before the pandemic. If you know what happened in the pandemic, 36% escalations roughly in costs, and we didn't get an extra dollar. And so we really had to kind of work with the city to kind of figure out, how do we do a simple building? And it's amazing what $700,000 buy. I mean, we're doing a building right now just to change a 50,000 square foot building, just to change all of the door handles was $1 million, just to put in perspective. So things have gotten a little crazy in the costs of them, but this $700,000 building felt is the best to kind of do a lot of community infrastructure. Now, the broader park was about a $7 million park, and it has ball fields. We did a lot of preservation of the trees on site and actually moved some of the trees near this building to preserve them. This is another project that we did in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it was for the Contemporary Art Museum. And so this was an historic industrial building. We love these kind of ugly, kind of buildings. There's nothing, they did see this as an historic structure. It was one of the few in Raleigh. And they asked us to kind of convert this into a new contemporary art museum. And so we really thought about, how do we begin to do that? And so the view that you were seeing before was kind of taken as a shot from this top right-hand side looking back. So we wanted to really create a garden, a porch, and other components to this. And we did this by looking at the facade. Now, the front facade along the street, which is, I'm not showing on here, was the historic preservation, or the historic facade. But we were able to kind of bring in a new entry to the side and this kind of new porch piece that we were designing to kind of integrate it. So again, this is the historic facade, and this is this kind of new one that we were able to open up to become the new entry into the old structure. And we actually renovated, brought back the historic the facade here, but really kind of creating this community space, a community porch. That's really the new entry into this. And I don't have any interior renders, but you can kind of get a sense of, it's this kind of metal screen, lots of copious shade, and then it can be used heavily for events. And this is like one of those other spaces that the museum got this double dipped kind of aspect, that now they rent out just their porch for weddings and other events and parties. And so, this is the kind of thing that we're always thinking of. How do we get elements in our architecture that gives us more than one thing? 1 + 1 has to equal 3, in some cases, right? I know we don't do math, elementary math, that well in my, but we're always looking at, how do we begin to really accentuate or promote or activate and utilize these kind of elements, so they can't get value engineered out. What I always call value engineering is really devalue engineering in some cases, because if you have an element in there that does these things performative, and this one shaded the building too, so it allowed us to reduce the size of the mechanical equipment, allowed us not to use insulated glass on that facade there because we were shading it, and some other smart things. And we do that even on this building. It's another building that pre-exists, but we're looking at these apertures and how does that play and kind of screen and shade the building. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about this project. So if you're familiar with the Art and Culture Center Hollywood, this is their current building. This is the Kagi Mansion from 1924. It was part of the Joseph Young. Actually, Kagi was one of Joseph Young's best salesmen and won this house from Joseph Young, who was the founder of Hollywood, was given this. Now, the arcade and other elements to the left here were actually added on as a funeral parlor in the 1960s to the house, the Mediterranean house, revival house that you can kind of see in there in the back. And so the Art and Culture Center of Hollywood asked us to look at an addition of 5,000 square foot of a new arts education wing to them. And this is right off of Arts Park, Young Circle in Hollywood, off of Harrison. And what we came in is this is the new addition. And if you know Hollywood, and it's actually, we didn't even do it in this rendering, but this is now a 30-story high-rise going in right across the street. Yes. Yeah, the bread building was just kind of off to the side there, but this is a 30-story high-rise that's kind of coming in here. And it was really going to overshadow and overpower the building. So our key concept was to really bow down to the existing historic structure, almost tie in kind of some of the language, tying in, backing up, and then kind of bringing this kind of swooping roof form that really scaled up to the presence of the street, but allowed for this community activation of this multi-purpose hall space at the front, which is facing north. Everybody always asks us, why do you have so much glass on a building and stuff? Well, this was facing north, and actually we're integrating some new technologies into this too that I won't talk too much about tonight, but there's ways in which we can kind of get this, but it's now about to start construction. I'll be breaking ground December 14th. I really think that they're not gonna break ground on December 14th. It will probably be after the first of the year, but this is the view from the street level. So you can get in kind of the presence, but again, we're trying to pay homage. And so the interesting thing is this will be completed in 2024. And the building is from 1924. So it's this kind of celebration of the 100 years between these two projects, and really kind of talking about innovation, because one of the biggest things that we see now in historic preservation is not to try to mimic what the historic building looked like, but still pay homage to it, respect it, and really find the scale and the proportions, the massing, everything that can kind of really tie back into it. And so that's something that was important, even though this building is not on the historic register. It's locally, but not on the state or anywhere else. And so that was what we kind of found was interesting. And most buildings we work on are not historically on the national register or even the state registers, but we still find the value, and we try to talk to our clients about maintaining it and kind of keeping those ideas. And you can even see through there's a key concept here is that they can have a multitude of events still happening in their historic structure while they have new events happening here. And then even in that entry, this kind of glass vitrine between the historic and the new structure, it goes out to a courtyard. And so that courtyard becomes a space that they can also lease out. And so again, these kind of ideas of being able to rent and have 3 events going on simultaneously while they can still maintain it. And it really helps to kind of, again, their bottom line, their maintenance and operations. And so currently, we're actually working at the University of Florida, which is my alma mater. I graduated there in 2004 with my master's of architecture. And so it was really humbling 2 years ago when we were given the honor of being hired to restore and look at the existing structure, which was a brutalist building done by Phyllis Candela in 1980. And then we're adding on this what we're calling the wishbone, which is these kind of 2 curved forms that's called the collaboratory. So it's about, the existing building is about 100,000 square feet, and the new collaboratory is about 56,000 square feet. And the new collaboratory has actually got all the high technology from the College of Design, Construction, and Planning. So it's the fashion labs with the robotic arms, with the laser cutter, with the, all of these different things. But it's also called the collaboratory because the upper floors are meant to be these collaboration spaces, education spaces, which is the most important thing right now you're seeing in higher education, especially in research hubs, is interdisciplinary, intercollaboration along these. And so that's why it's called the collaboratory. It's right along Stadium Road, kind of right across the street from the historic areas of the campus. Hence why we had to look at innovative ways to tie in brick onto the building. And this brick, we also had to meet a budget, a pretty hard budget. Most state institutions have those. And so how did we go ahead and think about this in an innovative way to still get it done in 16 months? And so this building is going to be built out of steel. The old building was out of concrete. And the only reason for that is because the cost of steel is much cheaper than concrete right now. It used to be a truckload of concrete was about $400 before the pandemic. It's about $1,500 right now. So, it's gone up about 4 to 5 times in its cost. And steel is starting to not come down, but it's leveling out. So it just made more sense. And so what we're able to do is normally you would not put brick on a steel building. And so we're prefabricating these wall panels and they'll be hung onto the building. And so it's one of the ways in which we're not only getting far superior insulation and sustainable kind of components on the building, but we're also going to be able to compress that time schedule for construction much larger, because we're already under construction for the building and they're already starting to fabricate the panels. So, these buildings will come together pretty quick. And so I just wanted to kind of showcase the existing, because some of the things that we've already started doing in the existing structure was, this is the atrium. And if you've ever been to University of Florida architecture building, this was our cathedral. When we went to school, this is what we always knew. But the building that Phyllis Candela originally designed had a house. It had a hard roof and it actually had open air, but it wasn't intended to be the top or have a top. In 1980, we had a recession, and so that was part of the value engineering that happened in the building. Well, one of the things that they never did was plan for the slabs having slopes. They never planned for the storefronts on that glass to actually have proper waterproofing. And so there was about $3 million in cost to just fix the water intrusion issues on this building. And so one of the things that we said was, why would we do that and spend $3 million when we could just go back to Phyllis Candela's plan and put a hat on it for $1 million? And that's what we ended up doing. And so we get this nice ETFE. If you know what ETFE is, it's that same like the Beijing Olympics or when you had the aquatic center. It's that same plastic film. And this is actually insulated. So it's a pillow of insulated film that let in 98% transmission of the daylight. We couldn't even do that with natural glass, with glassness. And that was one of the key concepts, is the students came out and against us, from putting any roof on there. And we had to prove to them that we were going to get this amount of daylight. And now when you go into that space, it's fantastic. When it rains like a day like today or yesterday, you get this kind of drumming, this humming, and it's just a special kind of space. And even now the music building is right next door and the band comes in there to practice. And it's just these percussions and these kind of elements that happen there that really make it special, but they could never really use that atrium space for models, for drawing, showcasing the students' work, and now that's used heavily, and they use it for all their fundraising events. And so this was just kind of one of those serendipitous elements, but it was a kind of funky space, and we called this concept the harp, because it's really just a ridge beam that's almost at an angle that just kind of casts over there. And this is just another view of the collaboratory itself. So you can see that canopy on that far left on top of the roof of the historic building. And then, this new collaboratory, and kind of really trying to play off of the brutalist building and how we kind of bring this in with the new brick facade. And interestingly enough, it's a sawtooth facade. And so that sawtooth facade, you can see we have these long glass elements. All that looks out north. So again, no direct solar heat gain. It's all kind of indirect light coming into there. And if you can look inside the large picture glass, this looks out at Taggart Hall, which is the most historic of the oldest building on campus, or at least one of the most well-preserved ones. And we have this social stair that kind of steps in, so you can really hang out there. We're trying to preserve all the trees and kind of working around them. And that's one of the reasons the shape of the building got to be that way. And this is fun because I can actually show this tonight. We couldn't show it yesterday, but we were in Sarasota yesterday reimagining Pei. If anybody knows I Am Pei, as an architect, he only did one building in Florida, and it's on the New College campus. And so we were asked out of one of 3 firms to come in there and reimagine what can we do with these buildings. These were the former dorms, student dorms on the facility, and they're in bad disarray. I mean, we were talking about mold, mildew, and it's what I wouldn't say was affectionately called it, but a lot of people have called it bulldozer bait. And we did not want it to be bulldozer bait. It's like, how do we preserve these buildings and think about how we give them a new life? And so this project was really reimagined to transitioning into these buildings, and how do we go ahead and add a 3rd floor? Because one of the biggest issues with them was water intrusion. Again, kind of like the hat, put a hat on it, and 2, we were really evocative to the bay. Sarasota Bay is an amazing space. And so we were calling this from Pei to the Bay, or from the Bay to Pei, and so kind of bringing this kind of water and sand, these kind of terracotta, blue terracotta elements because when Pei designed this, he called it a Mediterranean village. And so we were actually adding some of the Mediterranean Sea elements to it and kind of thinking through some of this. And so this is the kind of section we get, but we really were trying to really lightly, and I know it doesn't look too light, but the building floats over, and it's a wellness center as well as a community space for the new university president is really pushing this to be a sports an active kind of learning area. And so we're reimagining the pay structures, which could never have these large kind of grand public rooms for large community gathering or gyms or other elements, but we could go ahead and recreate them into classrooms, to wellness, yoga studios and other elements, and bringing that in there. And we were able to kind of look at how do we do this innovatively. And so you can see the pay buildings in that middle drawing are the 2 floors below that. And so we lift the new building up over there, kind of come back in surgically with this new structure to where we're not compromising the structure of pay. But in between that floor, we also put a new plenum of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and that we can drop it in below and also bring it in from the top. And so it really allowed for us to open up Pay's building even more so and now insulate it. It never had insulation before, and really providing a lot of shade and other interest to that project. And so you can see this is kind of a night view, but even that terracotta is slightly, in some cases it is solid, but in other cases we kind of pull it back so it's almost like a rain screen that allows light to still come through, but at night you get this kind of ephemeral look of it being very light and porous. And so this was these kind of elements that we were looking at. And this is another fun project that we just were asked to look at, and it's in an exhibit called Brutal DC. So if you're ever in SUMA, the Southern Utah Museum of Art right now, it's there, but it's going to be moving to the National Building or the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. Next year, early next year. But we were tasked with looking at the brutalist structures around the D.C. Mall. If you know what's going on right now, 90% of those buildings are vacant, and they're office buildings, federal office buildings. This is the former HUD, Housing and Urban Development Building, the Weaver Building, done by Marcel Brewer. It's about 90% unoccupied right now. And so we thought this was kind of funny because we wanted to convert it into affordable housing. So, it's the HUD building. How do we kind of do this and come in and give this building new life? There's a lot of issues with it from, again, water intrusion. So we began to look like, how do we begin to kind of look at it and be playful? We wanted to preserve these kind of outside walls, the brise-soleils that were there that kind of made it that signature brutalist structure. But how do we come in surgically again into the inner parts with this kind of more playful, artistic, bold colors? I think, as Daniel's kind of pointing out, we like bold colors. So you'll see a lot of blues, pinks, and yellows in our work. And this is kind of what it looks like over the top. So really, we're refocusing the housing social spaces to the center in that courtyard, terracing, kind of integrating roof gardens, elements that could begin to harvest rainwater, move that water around, but also kind of making it a more sustainable building. And this is just some of the kind of adaptive floor plates that we were beginning to use with these kind of petal leaves that would have these kind of social spaces, but it could be co-work as well as affordable housing or as well as market rate housing. We were kind of thinking it was ambidextrous and allowed for a lot of these different activities. And the pink areas are the existing cores of the building, so we were able to kind of adapt those. And then this image is kind of that inside courtyard area with these new kind of leaf-like structures that, again, we like kind of making things whimsical. So we kind of mirrored them on the underside. So you had this kind of reflectivity and really allowing daylight to get deep into the space, which was not currently happening. And so I'm going to pivot a little bit now because, I've been working on this project for reasons why I moved back to South Florida. And, I talked about Hurricane Andrew. It was a pivotal moment for me, but what I saw in 2014 when I moved back is one of the biggest challenges we have is how are we going to deal and reconcile climate change, issues around sea level rise? How are our buildings? How are our cities? How are our places? And so I've been working through Florida Atlantic University through our research, but also through our office at Brooks Scarpa on a project I call salty urbanism. And salty urbanism is a pedestrian term, and it's a kind of a play on words, salty, gritty, but salty because it's going to be salt water. But its actual project's name was ADAPT, and it's an acronym that stood for Adaptation Design and Planning Tool. And so this is our manual that's about to come out at the first of the year. And it's a compendium of just all of this work that was really looking at how are we going to engage in developing coastal resilience in our cities around sea level rise and climate adaptation. And I'm sure many of you are maybe familiar with this, but these are the 25 largest cities, most most challenged with coastal flooding. Don't worry, I did a cheat sheet for you. I just took out the 3 that aren't in Florida. So 22 of 25 are in Florida. And you can see we rank pretty high in South Florida. But it's kind of interesting. And you ask that question of like, we understand this as our iconic coastline, right? This is the iconic coastline we all know, Florida Keys, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, with just 6 feet of sea level rise. This is the projection. This is, all that blue is permanent inundation. So really what happens is we become the upper Keys. So I want to be an optimist because that's fantastic. It may be great fishing, it may be, but what the challenge is how do we learn to live on with and over water? It's really what our grandparents knew how to do in this area and kind of thinking about it. And just as the Eskimos know and have 100 words for snow, we really need to think about the ways in which we flood. And we have 5 ways we flood around storm surge from coastal storms. We have rainfall. We have urban runoff. And so one of the things that we don't think about is that most of our urban areas, Miami Beach is no different, is about 90% impervious. And when you put that in perspective with the research and the data, 10% imperviousness in a watershed begins to show environmental degradation. 30% is almost irreversible environmental degradation. So our urban areas need to do a lot better at kind of beginning to link ecosystem services with those urban services. So just like we build roads, streets, fire, police, water, sewer infrastructure, we need to start thinking about how do we inculcate or how do we adapt and put in ecosystem services. And these are primarily, I can be defined as 4 services that ecosystems do for us. Number 1 is flood management. Second is refuge, habitat. Third is food. And the 4th is temperature regulation, which is going to be another critical aspect for us as we start to look at hotter temperatures, more heat coming. And so we really need to begin to think about South Florida much different too, because we have a porous limestone substrate. We're not like New Orleans that can build levees and dikes. But I find that as an amazing proposition for us, again, of how we can kind of rethink how we live on with and over water. That's going to be a really critical thing as we're looking into the future. And just highlighting, this is Las Olas Boulevard. I mean, I could have taken, but I wanted to use Fort Lauderdale examples because I didn't want to beat everybody up too hard here. But this is Las Olas Boulevard. This is not a single drop has fallen from the sky. You all hear these, the blue sky flooding or the king tides. These are just challenges that we have. This was another thing that happened during Hurricane Irma in Fort Lauderdale. This is A1A. We just spent about $6 million renourishing our beach about 3 months before Hurricane Irma hit. All that sand ended up on A1A. And guess what happens? That sand couldn't be brought back to the beach. It's now picked up hydrocarbons, toxins, and other things in our urban environment, so it had to be brought to a landfill. And that's just an unfortunate aspect, but why did that happen? It's because we took away the sand dunes, or what let's really call them, the root dunes, right? And we did that for obvious reasons. We want to have that view, that kind of linkage to the beach, but there's ways in which that we can begin to do that in a smarter, kind of more aesthetic way. April 12th, a major event for us in Fort Lauderdale. You had something similar yesterday here in Miami Beach, but this was 26 inches of rainfall fell in a 24-hour period of time. That is the most rainfall that has fallen at any moment in the state of Florida in any historical record that they know of. And so that was a huge challenge. And it wasn't just 24 hours. It really fell in only a 9-hour period of time. And so I just want to kind of show this because I think it's ironic, but this is our students at Florida Atlantic University School of Architecture, which is right on Las Olas, floating around. They did this last night too. I just didn't get that updated video. But this was April 12th. But it really made me think, in South Florida, it's kind of interesting. We have fire extinguishers in our buildings. We have all these other things, but we don't have flotation devices. Why not? It's like we should probably be thinking about that. But these students were very entrepreneurial. Moxie's, which is a bar downtown, they were able to go ahead and ferry people from Moxie's to their cars and getting, getting $100 here and there. And, it was a pretty amazing thing. But we had these boats in our building that students 15 years ago built, and they had never been utilized in 15 years until this event. So, and so what we kind of began to look at was the city of Fort Lauderdale asked us to look at North Beach Village, which is a little enclave that they named it just south of Bonnet House, which is there. As you see kind of the green tree patch to the north of those pink lines there. And they asked us to kind of look at this. And it was a great example because if you project this 6 feet, and by the way, Fort Lauderdale brands itself as the Venice of America. And so I kind of told them, well, if that's your brand, let's make it the Venice of America. But this is what's going to happen if they don't do anything at all. This is actually 6 feet projected over that neighborhood. And this is where they have some of their largest mid-century modernism. This is where Charles McKiernan and a lot of those types have their architecture in this area. And so it's a big challenge how they're going to begin to adapt with 6 feet of sea level rise and that permanent inundation on the western part of this neighborhood. And that western part was actually reclaimed from the ocean. It was old tidal marsh. And so I always say, if we reclaimed it from nature, nature's going to reclaim it from us pretty soon. So, it's, but there's ways in which we can work with that. But you can see the coastal ridge, much where we're standing and sitting here today. It's going to be high and dry for the extended period of time. And so what we asked in this Salty Urbanism project was, how do we begin to look at a couple different toolboxes, one of which was this kind of forensic ecology. How do we understand what was once there as a model for how do we begin to think about the ecology, the geology, and the hydrology of the area, and really beginning to think about what type of landscape species are appropriate to go there. And then that was like one aspect. So we studied the barrier island. So this is just a section of the barrier island. We did this across all the different ecotypes in the South Florida area, whether it be the Everglades, the transverse glades, the coastal ridge, and these barrier islands. But we also had another toolbox, and many of these are things we know: living shorelines. There are root dunes, as I was mentioning, breakwaters, sand engines, constructed wetlands, so on and so forth. What we would term green infrastructure, or what sometimes we even say green stormwater infrastructure, GSI, or what some even refer to as low impact development infrastructure technologies. And so these are the kind of techniques, but two, we also developed the plant palette. And I always get a bunch of, and I know it's small, don't worry, you can't read it. You can look it up online, it's available as an image, or you can buy the book, or you can just download the book. I'm not trying to plug the book for sale, but these are the plants that really will survive in a high salt tolerant and less salt tolerant kind of environment. So what you're seeing here is just akin to the periodic table of elements. It's working from left to right to more salt tolerant, and then from top to bottom, shade trees down to ground covers. And so you can see our palette is going to be very limited as we kind of start to look at more saltier conditions. And this is not salt spray. This is salt, your feet are wet in salt. This is the roots are getting that. And then looking at the architecture, how do we begin to think about flood adaptive architecture and everything from left to right, abandonment, which we really have to kind of consider, just like cities have planning departments, I think they really need to start thinking about unplanning departments. One of the things that we really wanted to look at in this kind of idea of unplanning was, if buildings are going to be susceptible, we're not imagining people are going to go there and demolish them and take them away, right? That's kind of a fallacy. We need to start thinking about them as artificial reefs in the future or something to that extent. So the materiality we're putting in these is going to become critically important. And unfortunately, a lot of our built environment has toxic and carcinogenic materials. And so we're really thinking about the things we already know we do well: flood-proofing the site, flood-proofing the building. A lot of those kind of second tier on that left-hand side are things that even the city of Miami Beach, we do a lot of: wet flood-proofing, dry flood-proofing, and aspects, or raising things up on mounds, stilts, but even looking at amphibious or floating structures. I mean, the fact that we have all of these typologies already exist here in Miami Beach. You think about Stiltsville, just there in Key or off of Key Biscayne. I can remember there as a kid boating around, and it was fantastic. You'd have this community out there. Now it's unfortunate that's 4 or 5 houses left. And it's we have these kind of technologies or this kind of history, but we kind of have chosen to build in one way as a kind of rubber stamp approach. And so really what we're asking the Salty Urbanism is to kind of reinvent and rethink, especially when we're trying to create more affordable places. And so when we came and brought these ideas to the city of Fort Lauderdale and to this North Beach Village neighborhood, we developed 3 scenarios. And so these 3 on the right are the 10 to 60 year options. This is what, they have to do, because one of the things that's hardest to think about is where is sea level rise going to be at in 60 years, right? Things have changed a lot in the last 60 years to today. And so you really have to kind of put that mindset. And unfortunately, in our planning departments, when we're thinking about these, a lot of planning departments look at the last 3 to 5 years to project the next 3 to 5. And that's a mistake, right? Especially when the game's changing. And so these were put out there as ways in which that they could do it, because 0 to 10 years, you're really having to plan for it, figuring out how to buy it, figuring out how to pay for it, all these kind of aspects, and designing it and engineering it. And so these were the kind of 10 to 60 year, and it's 2 mortgage cycles, right? If you think about it that way, or the life of infrastructure is about 50 years. And so you're really thinking about what is that next cycle? And I don't know if you know the Brookings Institute, but the Brookings Institute has this staggering statistic that came out about 2 years ago that said 80% of the built environment projected to exist by 2050 currently does not exist. Say that some of those are going to be adaptive reuse of historic structures, I'm hoping. And I think that's our mission, is how do we begin to think about those historic structures? But this is our opportunity. If we can see that in the next 30 years, if things are going to change that drastically, we have a unique opportunity right now to look at the next level of development and getting it right and making it pay for itself. Because I don't think the federal government's going to come in. I don't think the state's going to come in. How do we kind of design and plan and manage for this? And so the first 0 to 10 years, we kind of told the city of Fort Lauderdale to take it, if they're going to make private development, do these things, we need to start looking at how is the public realm going to start to take on these challenges. And so what we call botanizing the asphalt of North Beach Village. If you remember what I was saying, 90% impervious surfaces in urban environments, this is 90% impervious there in North Beach Village. And so we started to ask them to begin to look at this kind of green jacket. And one of the things that, if anybody's ever tried to get a permit with the Army Corps of Engineers, it's like an act of Congress. It is like you have better luck getting a meeting with the Pope, probably, than getting a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers to put anything out into a navigable waterway. Anything 18 inches past the line of a seawall. And so what we looked at, and we were talking with the developers in North Beach Village, is they were willing to give back a whole full block, about 150 to 200 foot block, back to nature if they could go ahead and get some transfer development rights, other aspects that they could begin to build this. Because one of the things, and I don't know if you can read it there in that top, but just 15 foot of marshy terrain, a shoreline edge, can drop down 50% wave energy and 25% of storm surge, just 15 feet. And so if you're getting 200 feet, 300 feet, you're doing a lot to protect the buildings and the communities around those. And so this was the biggest challenge, is how do we begin to kind of get the city to think in these ways? Because it's not a fun thing to think about. I have to go ahead and give up property, or I'm going to have to do these things. But we're coming into a time where cities are going to be forced to make decisions and de-annexing or unplanning areas unless we begin to think about them first. And so what salty urbanism was trying to do was look at the neighborhood unit down to the scale of the block, down to the scale of the building. Because what we're doing really well is developing policies at a city, at a regional level. But what we're not doing well is working with those neighborhoods and figuring out plans to make them more resilient, because that takes design, and that challenge to really kind of get down to that is very tough. And so this is what some of those streetscapes, this was actually a nicer street on the top here of the existing. It actually had some green swales, like grass swales, but most of it was like asphalt from building edge to building edge with parking lots. And so this botanizing the asphalt was really kind of coming in and creating these rain gardens, which had actually a double benefit of slowing traffic down, creating more slow streets in these late neighborhood and residential communities where you get these kind of yield conditions, but you're also beginning to bring in these kind of ecosystem services where you have evapotranspiration, filtration, and other aspects. I bring this image because this is not North Beach Village, but many of you may know what the top image is. You know the Garden District in New Orleans. Many of you may not know what the bottom image, but that's pointless. If you didn't see the hill in the background, you'd probably think that was out west of town in the suburbs, right? Because that's what modern codes have kind of done. Like they've kind of diminished ecosystem services in our built environment. But what our grandparents all knew was how to build healthy neighborhoods, healthy places that looked at the triple bottom line, how they created economic, environmental, and social spaces. And so you're seeing these kind of conditions, but I don't know if you know how our streets are designed in our public realm. They're based on what is called the Green Book. And there's nothing green about it except for when AASHTO, the American Society of Highway and Transportation Officials, developed the book. They sent it to the printer. The printer didn't have any other color but green. Green got put on the cover and it just became affectionately known as the Green Book. Well, in that book, they call trees FHOs, fixed and hazardous objects. They call sidewalks auto recovery lanes. And so it doesn't bode well for pedestrians in the way we design streets for the last 60, 70 years. And so that's our biggest challenge. And so when you go into these neighborhoods, and this is what I always ask the mayor, city commissioners, is what neighborhoods do you love in your community? And they will inevitably always say the 100-year-old neighborhood are old. You know, it's because those are the neighborhoods that are neighborhoods. They're not subdivisions, they're not cookie cutter, they're not repetitive. And so these are the kind of challenges that we're trying to look at. How do we begin to kind of make place? And so this was another option that we talked about, this kind of strategic retreat, which was moving away from the Western, but it wasn't saying we couldn't build in the West. It was just saying we may build differently. We'd have some of these amphibious or floating structures. We would actually have buoyant kind of platforms that could move up and down with the tidal flooding and the sea, any storm surges and other elements. And so it was also a kind of interesting aspect to look at how do you kind of make this life aquatic. The other thing we were always asked is how do we deal with the state bird, the mosquito, right? You know, the mosquito is a big challenge. One of the reasons why we got rid of the mangrove forest was because of the mosquito, you know, that they bring and breed disease. Zika was a huge thing when we were first kind of planning this, now with COVID and other things. But these are things that we can kind of develop new ways of thinking that we understand about ecological pest management. So bat houses, purple martin houses. But the other thing that's interesting is dragonflies. Dragonflies, I love them, but they eat mosquito larvae and they're weight in mosquito larvae in a day, just like the purple martins and the bats will do for the most part. And so these kind of things we need to bring back and kind of look at how we work with them. And so this was the third and final kind of proposal. And it was the most radical proposal that we asked the community to consider in North Beach Village, but it was this land adjustment or this kind of islands and atolls. And it had this kind of dual benefit of branding it the Venice of America because you had these waterways now around this, but it created more shoreline edge because keep in mind when I was saying shoreline edge will create more ecosystem services, we could get living shoreline, these kind of marshy terrain, but it also created more land value because the edge is where the land value is. Right, and so that's where you had this kind of duplicity. And so then we've kind of stepped it now, and I'll just breeze through this real quick because I know it's hard to read some of these things, but we started looking at how do we apply this across the matrix of South Florida at different ecotypes. And so looking at the Everglades, how do we do that? Looking at these kind of transverse glades where the canals were, how do we begin to thicken those canals, widen them to begin to integrate these kind of communities that are more water-based or more flood resilient. And then looking at the coastal ridge and even looking back at these coastal corridors and how we begin to design them. And so a lot of this is kind of built into that manual. And so I'm going to just leave on these last few projects, which are where we're testing these ideas out now in the real world. So we're working right now in DC Alexander Park, which downtown Fort Lauderdale is there off to the left-hand side, kind of with the blue highlight. Las Olas, they built this new Oceanside Park. We're now building DC Alexander Park, which is just about a half mile south of that new Oceanside Park, right in front of the Swimming Hall of Fame, if you're familiar with Fort Lauderdale Beach. And so this park is gonna look like this when it's done. Right now it's a parking lot. And it's right across the street again from the Swimming Hall of Fame. But one of the things that we did was reinvigorate, redoing and restoring the dunes, the coastal dunes in the front, creating a kind of plaza, a shade hammock, creating this what's protected play, but it is a playground in the center with rubberized facilities for kids. But we're moving up a new dune that's about 5% slope. And why we did 5% slope is because you don't have to have handrails and all that other stuff that just gets in the way and looks ugly, you know. And so it's just gentle slope that moves you up to this outlook, this perch of about 25 foot over the natural grade, which is where you can watch the moon rise and the sunrise and everything. And it's got stadium seating that you can kind of see in the nose there that kind of steps down. I thought I was evoking a jumping tarpon out of the water. Some people say it's an iguana. You take your pick, whatever it's. But you know, this back of it was all coastal strand or coastal new infrastructure or ecosystems infrastructure. And so the existing site is there on the left, kind of how that storm surge, like I was showing you that image of the sand. This was in front of this project. And so we're actually going to be enhancing some of the dunes on the wave wall side, on the beach side of this. And so you're seeing what the new park will do is kind of begin to break that up, wave action, but also kind of keep the sand in place and begin to protect actually even the hotels and the Swimming Hall of Fame behind it with some of these actions and these kind of elements that we're doing. And so we're building it right now. If you go down there, this is under construction. This is actually looking out towards that water. So you can see they started beginning to build some of those dunes back into the beach side. And we're starting to integrate some of these, but there's that kind of wall that starts to move up. And you can kind of see those two yellow sticks kind of in the center there. That's the columns that are going to be looking over at that perch. And so this is the kind of the view of what that looks like at the ground. And so that's planning to be done around April. And so this was kind of a new public space. It's meant to be part of the Loop. I'm sorry. They're branding the Loop, which is the Oceanside Park, kind of coming down to DC, Alexander Park. And so they're kind of planning this for the boat show, Dry Tortuga, or the Tortuga Festival, and all these other kind of events, as well as spring break. Unfortunately, they do love it there. It gets a lot of money, so, you know. But this is meant to be more of a passive park, unlike the Oceanside Park that's more of a active kind of entertainment park where they'll have music events and everything. This one's more about contemplative, but the city wanted an Instagram moment. And so the idea is that you hang out in the perch and people take your photo, right? You know, and so that's the kind of premise there. And so I'm going to come back to talking about these because, you know, one of the things when I was a kid growing up, you know, was looking at Andy Sweet photos, right? You know, the Andy Sweet photos were just amazing. And I can always remember these, like when I was coming here as a kid, this is what I would see. You know, this was when they started to have the Art Deco weekends, everything as I was getting older. And actually at New World School of the Arts, I was in the visual arts program. They would bring us to Miami Beach once a year. We would paint on site and then we'd sell those paintings at the Art Deco weekend, as well as the Coconut Grove Arts Festival. And so it was always a kind of interesting thing, but I can remember seeing these photos and always really interested in them and watching The Last Resort. And so we were given this opportunity where we answered a call from the Housing Authority of the City of Miami Beach to look at affordable elderly housing. And this is a critical need that we have here. And so, you know, in the firm, like we look at the idiosyncratic kind of bespoke nature of a place. What you'll see in all of our architecture that I'm showing, it probably doesn't show a certain style, right? It's because we're always trying to find the place to tell us kind of where do we take our cues. And those cues can come from nature, they can come from the architecture. And so we were looking and really interested in this kind of Miami Beach red, which is interestingly, it's pink. I always wanted to make a pink building. This building was called the Heron. It was given to us by that. And the fact is that we had Messi now, which we didn't have Messi then when we first designed the building, but you have the football, the soccer league now that is the pink Heron, you know. So anyways, we were really intrigued by this kind of attitude, but I love breeze block. This was such a ubiquitous material here. And how do we begin to think about that? And so we kind of went and designed this project. So this is 20 units of elderly affordable housing. And this is in Normandy Isles, right there on Marseille Drive at 1158 Marseille Drive. And unfortunately, there is a Gilbert Fine building on this site, and it's a 4-unit, single-story building. It has a triplet. It's a triplet, but it has twins off to the west side of it that actually form the courtyard. So this one was like half a court, you know. But it is also very susceptible to tidal flooding in there. It's a very low-lying area. And so we were challenged with how do we begin to kind of think about this. And one of the critical aspects is how, if we did raise the natural grade, but this was thinking about 8 feet of sea level rise or so, like we have to build up to these kind of new levels. And so some of the things that we began to look at were the scalloped facades, the scalloped walls that you would get of just evocative of the Miami modern kind of style, or even Art Deco had some of the, but the breeze block, these other elements, but also how do we kind of create these terrace stairs so it doesn't just feel like a major stoop, but it feels like a social space. We wanted to minimize that, and that's why even the lower stairs are a social stair. So these are like more amphitheater type seating, where the main stair is off to the side. That's where you have these kind of rails, and then you have ramps that kind of move in off the side into the building. But one of the things that you'll notice is there's a stair front and center. This is elderly affordable housing. One of the things that we want to think about is active and healthy lifestyles, not making the elevator the first thing you see, but making the stair and this kind of way in which we could bring it up the street, or the street into the building, what we call this kind of social street, up to the 4th floor. And so if I just kind of go back real quick, at the top floor, the 4th floor, there's a large roof terrace that looks out, and that's where the community room is. And it's this kind of sculptural front. Now, if I took the breeze block building or breeze block jacket off, you'd probably say this is a pretty ugly building. Not much architecture, because it is affordable housing. But I always look at this and attribute it like a Greek temple. What was a Greek temple other than a dumb box with a great wraparound porch? It's like, architecture is really in how you skin sometimes the buildings, but it's the spaces and everything when you get into these. And so we were really kind of cognizant of how that breeze block, how this kind of landscape and how it kind of ties back into the community in a very, harmonious way in the scale. Because we're not, but the Housing Authority is also building another 4-story structure just to the east of this, and then there's the 1-story structures from Gilbert Fine to the west of it too. But this is the ground floor, so it is parking. Miami Beach does not require parking for elderly housing, but we put it in anyways because we want to be good stewards. We were taking out 2 parking spaces in the street, and it was just, right, but as elderly, they're going to have deliveries, they're going to have other elements, so we wanted to make sure and ensure we had those. But you can kind of see how far back the elevators are tucked back in there, the mailboxes, but you get this kind of open porch space where it really becomes, again, a social space as you kind of move up into this kind of pinwheel stair, and there you get these are studio units, so they are single occupancy. This is meant to be single occupant units, but they're all around this kind of breezeway, and then you get the other stair on the bottom left there, you can see. But this whole thing kind of orients to the southeast, to our prevailing breezes, allowing those open airflow to kind of move through these spaces so they become naturally ventilated. We've kind of done a lot of the math on this, checked the energy modeling on this. One of the things that we think is affordable shouldn't just be your rent and the day you kind of move in and how you build it. It should also be the residents that live there, making it affordable. So we're projecting their electric bills to only be about $30 on average a month, and that's if they closed all the windows. But we've designed the windows to allow passive ventilation to move through this. And so the idea is to really make it integrated with the landscape and actually make it part of the resiliency in this. And so this is the top floor, the 4th floor. So just so you know, like the 2nd and 3rd floor are the same. So they both look like this. And then you get up to the 4th floor, and that's where that community, that roof terrace, where the code requires a step back. And so we wanted to make that space a social space and kind of coming into it. And so this is the section. You can kind of see through the community room, that social stair, and how it kind of gets built up. But this was like if you had an Irma-like event with 6 feet of sea level rise, how much that top blue line would be in this space. And so this is why it's so critical. We have to build in a flood adaptive way. Some of the things that we're doing on that ground floor is also putting what's called Zypex into our concrete. Everybody knows, unfortunately, what happened in Champlain South and Surfside. Part of that was, salt water is cancer to buildings. We also put in rebar, steel reinforcing in a lot of our structures. The salts that get into the concrete will actually spall it, make it chip away. And so one of the things that we need to do is really think about making sure the concrete is not permeable. And so this Zypex is an additive that we can do that. We're also using galvanized steel. We want to look at fiberglass or basalt, which is an alternative to steel. But the biggest challenge is not when you're below the water table, You can put all the steel you want in the world because it won't rust out, because it's where that tidal zone happens, where this littoral of it, where it drops up and down the groundwater. And where it gets flooded. That's where the biggest challenge is, where you need to kind of look at these other more innovative ways in which to do it. Because, this is the irony that I find, is that FEMA makes us design to flood adaptive architecture as it is, but what they're not thinking about is the materials of our buildings. They're only thinking about how we design fundamentally the ground and making sure the structure doesn't fall down during the storm, but over time, 40, 50 years, that's where the challenge gets. And so these are just some of the interior spaces, that kind of social stair. So you can see we like pink. And then this is the last project I'll show. This is just the breeze. And so we're now in Normandy Shores working on 119 units of elderly affordable housing. And so this is really a tough, challenging site, because this is even lower than what the Heron site was, just one island over. And so we have some incredible challenges where the city's also already preparing to build these roads up about 3.5 to 5 feet in the future. So how do we kind of begin to tie them? So again, you can kind of see the terracing steps. That terrace is actually at that new street level. So we're just thinking about how do we make this resilient, so in the future, when they do raise the road, it doesn't look like it wasn't intentional or wasn't meant to be, that we, something like you see it happen in Sunset Harbor or these other areas, like it looked intentional that you have these elements. I mean, it's unfortunate because you have some of the buildings around us that are just very low lying, but what we're still trying to do is, this is the Breeze project. So this one's right on the Biscayne waterway. So this one's on the water. The other one is actually on the golf course. And these are the two vacant lots. If you look at South Shore Drive on Normandy Shores, there's two vacant large parcels. Actually, Breeze is actually under construction right now. We're rebuilding the seawall, and they have their signs up. So they're starting construction in December for the buildings proper. But we're really trying to be sculptural with the facades, much like the MIMO or the kind of Art Deco styles, but really pushing back and really trying to respect the neighbors and that kind of massivity that we're looking at, but using the breeze block accents and just lifting these buildings up. This is kind of what the current code allows us to do. You get a step back at the 4th floor, you get a massive building, but we want to break it. And what that second diagram from the left is showing, then we want to create a courtyard, raise that courtyard. So it's still a typology we all know, the courtyard typology. And then we kind of tuck parking underneath there and some social spaces. So this is actually the courtyard level, which is 1 floor above the parking. But again, very similar units. And these are the kind of sections. And so some of the things that you'll see, is again, this challenge of how do we get and make sure and ensure that the people that are living here can stay here. It's a hardened structure. So this is meant to withstand a Category 5. They can stay in place and shelter in place during this. This has got the generators. It's got, and even if there wasn't generators, just like you saw after Hurricane Irma, where we lost power for 8 days, and unfortunately in Hollywood, where you had a lot of elderly residents pass away because of the heat, that it was because those buildings were not designed in a passive way, and they were designed with fixed windows. And so we're really being cognizant, again, doing the studies that understand how wind flow is going to work through here. I'm not saying you're going to be cold, but you're not going to be, you're not going to be hot, right? It's going to be comfortable, is what we tried to design it for, is comfortable. And so this is, you can see the blue down here on the bottom left. That's the actual Biscayne waterway. So one of the things that we're really cognizant is opening up some of these social spaces, making another social stair at the 3rd and 4th levels where people can sit out and kind of watch the water, watch boats go by. But there's a really kind of thought process, and this is the backside that you're just kind of seeing of that portal, that social stair, and kind of hanging out. And again, I hate always showing this because you can see, like, this is if it was king tides like we're having right now. But, those are fairly low structures, but what we're really trying to build in is a living shoreline. We're being very cognizant of protecting our neighbors and how we're kind of designing to where all the stormwater that's on our site, and this is a problem when you start raising structures, is you can push that water off to your neighbors if you're not careful. And so the first thing that we were is working with these neighbors, talking about it and ensuring that we had the right civil engineer. The good thing is I'm a landscape architect and an architect, so we were doing all of this with our project to really make the site a sponge and thinking about it in those ways, but also kind of making it, a piece of artwork and a piece of community infrastructure that we can see that will be here for the next 60 years in its intended lifespan. So with that, I'm done. Thank you. I may have gone a little over. Sorry.
So we have time for a couple questions for the that want to ask anyone in the audience. Any questions? Sure.
With the use of, all of our villages have like stuffing. Fish. Okay, and I know with the stuff up in the country, they tell us where they use it, or to go on and everything, they just hard to
Right.
buy it, so.
Right.
That is from resilient.
Not really. Like, so this is actually stucco, and we're trying to do like some hardy siding into there, some cementitious board. It's just really hard to do sometimes, especially natural stone. So we are looking at precast stones and other things, because again, you can get that, it's all about water intrusion when you start to get into the facade and the envelope of the building. Water is the biggest thing, the challenge for architects to kind of deal with, because, you know, we hate roofs, we hate windows, but we love them at the same time, because that's, you know, the windows where we get daylight in, but they're where most water can kind of come in. So we're challenged too, because this is an affordable project. So these things, you know, what's unfortunate is you're not even seeing 30% of the cost of this building is actually underground in the structure. And that's just the footers, the foundations, the piers that have to kind of hold this up, because this is sitting on what we call muck. And muck is just a fancy word for dead mangroves, you know, unfortunately. You know, it's we're kind of sitting in these areas. And so we want to make sure, again, this is structurally sound. So we're spending quite an investment just in the structure of this project to make sure that it's the most resilient it can be. And that allows, that I guess disallows us sometimes to kind of use certain materials in a kind of very blanketed way. And so when you start to look at the front, you know, we're being very strategic and surgical, like where we're using breeze block, but we also kind of integrate there next to the breeze title, the sign on the building, there is tile. There's like these kind of terracottas, other things that we're adding as accents, but we're not able to put it everywhere. And so one of the things that we are putting on the front of this that we're not showing in this image is a sparkle grain. It's actually some glass chips. So when you're walking by or driving by, it's going to sparkle. And so, you know, so my partner always says, we're going to be playing Fibonacci, or not Fibonacci, sorry, Liberace, while you walk by these. So, you know, so at least like the material, even though it's a ubiquitous material like stucco, which is what we can kind of afford, we're doing something to it that at least is a little bit more unique. And so some of the other things that you'll see is there's not a lot of windows facing the street on this. They're all facing the social space, because we only get one shot to have one window or two windows. And so they're looking at the sides or looking at the back. And this is really more about a sculptural kind of element. And we want to remove rails. And so you can even see at that second floor where all that landscape is, we're able to kind of step the landscape to remove any rails from there. So you really have a connection to the street too, because that's the other kind of critical thing, is getting connections to the street. And so these kind of terraces really allow for some of that aspect. And so, you know, it's, again, it's about the cost and where we want to spend money. But yes, you know, if it was a museum, I could do a lot, you know, when you have a $1,200 a square foot budget. But when you have a $350 a square foot budget, there's not much you can kind of do, you know. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.